morning, everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII podcast. I am absolutely delighted to introduce for the second time Dr Elizabeth Norton, and today we'll be talking about the love letters of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. How are you today, Elizabeth?
I'm good. How about you? Thank you for inviting me on.
Absolute pleasure. Can't wait to talk to you about this fascinating subject because it's quite a lot of information of what we know of the beginning of Anne and Henry's relationship came from these letters, and unfortunately there's just not a lot of them, is there?
No, so unfortunately, and it's a very one-sided correspondence, because of course when we talk about the love letters of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, actually what we mean are the love letters of Henry VIII, because we don't have Anne's replies.
And that actually leads us to the first question. Is one of the earliest letters that we have from Henry to Anne Boleyn. He's writing about his torment, about not being able to call her his mistress, or Anne's refusal to become his mistress. And we see this repeated in a lot of the letters that we have from Henry. What are the chances that Anne replied to these letters? And if she didn't reply, or didn't reply to all of them, is this because she was just not interested in Henry, or the quite common belief is that she was trying to make him love her more, to show him that this just wasn't another fling?
So it's an interesting one because we do just have Henry's correspondence. We've got 17 letters. They're in the Vatican archives. So it's not impossible that Anne didn't reply to everyone. She definitely replied to some, and we can see that in Henry's correspondence. For example, he mentions something that she sent him, which very much suggests that she sent him a message or a letter. So I think we can safely say that there were once love letters written by Anne in response to some of these letters. Whether she replied to all of them, I'm not sure, because of course we're very used to this, the concept of Anne refusing to be the king's mistress, and she clearly does. We can see that in the correspondence, and of her retreating home to Hever Castle, where a lot of the letters have been sent to. So I think, it's arguable that she doesn't reply. It's one thing turning down the king. It's probably quite another completely ignoring his letters. So my guess would be that she does reply. I suspect she's quite lukewarm. He certainly implies at times that he's frustrated by the fact that she's not showing more affection for him. Because he says at one point he's been stricken with the dart of love, for example, and he's just not getting the responses he wants. But I would suspect that Anne does reply. But I think we can safely say that at least early on, her responses are quite lukewarm. She's trying to push the king away. She doesn't want to be his mistress, and who can blame her, because actually being Henry VIII's mistress is pretty rubbish, really. Bessie Blount Bessie Blount gives birth to the king's child, his acknowledged child, and she gets married off to a peer, which is a pretty good marriage, but equally Henry's not really putting any of his own money into this. She's basically being married off to a slightly higher status person. Mary Boleyn really doesn't do well out of the marriage, sort of out of the relationship. For Anne, it's social ruin. She's not going to make a good marriage if she sleeps with the king. So why would she?
And it's interesting that you say that all the letters, or most of them, were sent to Hever Castle. And there's quite the belief that perhaps Anne's father or brother had a say in if she did write back in what she said. Do you think that they would have had access to these letters from Henry VIII?
I would imagine that, obviously people would be aware that a messenger has arrived from the king, because we don't have the postal service back then to any great extent. So, they'll be ridden over. So certainly members of Anne's family are going to be aware that she's received a message from the king. So I think it's improbable that they wouldn't have asked to see the contents. And of course, it affects the entire family as well. It's very debatable what role Thomas Boleyn plays in Anne's relationship with the king. And I tend to agree more with his recent biographer, Lauren Mackay, on the idea that he's less involved than we think. I mean, he's been accused of pimping out his daughters. He's been accused of pimping out his wife, actually. That was a contemporary claim against him. But I think in general, I think we can give the agency to Anne. And I think initially, she's certainly not looking for the queenship. She really just wants Henry to go away. But slowly it begins to dawn on her, I think, that perhaps there is something in this relationship with Henry. But she's still very firm in that she will only accept marriage.
And it's quite interesting you say that about Thomas Boleyn, is because we have such a big stigma that he's the reason that Anne rose to power. He's the reason, Anne fell from power because, the Boleyns got too greedy and things. That's not what happened whatsoever. And I think that a lot of people are starting to realize that now. And I think that's the great thing about these letters. We see that it wasn't just Anne who was spurring it on, it was Henry. And he was quite being persistent in a way, and he was a bit rude sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do. I think it denies women's agency somewhat to say that it's just their father pushing them on. You know, I mean, Thomas Boleyn undoubtedly benefit from the relationship between Anne and Henry. You know, he probably wouldn't have secured his grandfather's Irish earldom. He almost certainly wouldn't have become Earl of Wiltshire. But this doesn't mean that he's the architect of it. And I think we really can see Anne. But I think at its heart, it's Henry. Henry is clearly besotted with Anne, and we can see this in his letters. I mean, at times he can be quite crude, and there's one where he talks about, you know, effectively wanting to fondle her pretty duckies, and that's slang for breath. He talks about wanting to be in her arms. You know, he clearly is very sexually interested in Anne, but also admires her as a person. And I think one of the clearest indications we have of Henry's affection for Anne is he actually writes these letters himself, because Henry hated writing, always tried not to write if he could get away with it, you know, uses a scribe, uses secretaries. So the fact that he does sit down and write these quite lengthy letters, I think, is very, very telling. And also he's very sweet. He's like a lovesick puppy at times. And there's some letters he draws little heart around their initials. You know, he clearly really loves Anne Boleyn.
And just a quick question just before, because I know that a lot of our readers might not know this, but kings and royals, they didn't tend to write their own letters, did they? It was somebody who wrote it for them. They were dictating it. In a way, is it that he perhaps, because he wrote them himself, he was keeping them quite private, because obviously if he had somebody else wrote it, they would have known, and then perhaps it could have become court gossip, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. Monarchs tended not to write their own letters, and they're very formulaic. I mean, particularly when we go into the medieval period, it's really, letters are formal. They don't really give me any sense of character. You know, they'll be trusty and well beloved, we greet thee well, you know, and things like that. So they're not written by their own hand. We do start to get more personal letters in the 16th century from royalty and nobility, but still, in general, Henry VIII won't write his own letters, and they tend to be quite formulaic. I think you're absolutely right. He doesn't really want the contents of these letters getting out. They'd be quite embarrassing if they get out. Also, will obviously cause a diplomatic incident. He's married to Catherine of Aragon. He's always been quite discreet about his love affairs, and you know, actually, he won't want the contents of these letters to get out. However, of course, people will be well aware that he's sending these messengers down to Hever. So I think most people who are sort of knowledgeable at court will be well aware that he's courting Anne Boleyn.
And that actually brings us to the next question of his letters. Is, you mentioned that obviously he was in a diplomatic marriage that was quite well received across the world. You know, Catherine of Aragon was from a very respectable family. She was a respectful woman and respectable queen. And it's believed that these letters were stolen, I believe, to reveal the affair. And I think they went to the Vatican. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So, sorry, yeah, carry on. Interrupted
okay.
I'm just too excited.
Same here. I mean, it's quite a weird idea to think that your letters were stolen to reveal the affair, because at the time, obviously, the idea that Henry was trying to be with another woman against this fierce, strong Spanish queen. If Anne did reply to his letters, obviously they probably wouldn't have also been stolen by the Vatican, because it served them no purpose. But is it believed that if they were found, would the Vatican have destroyed them? Or if they were still in Henry's possession, do you think he destroyed them after her death, perhaps?
So it's one of the great ironies of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's love story, and obviously it doesn't end as a love story, but it's one of the great ironies that the love letters are in the Vatican archives, because that seems like the least likely place they would be. So I mean, it's pretty clear that they were stolen. They were presumably stolen from Anne Boleyn, because they're letters that were sent to her. So I would assume that she kept them tied together as a packet, and that they've been stolen from her possessions and taken to the Vatican. The most likely person to have done that is, I would suggest, Cardinal Campeggio, who is the absentee Bishop of Salisbury, who comes over to try the validity of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and presides over the Blackfriars trial of the marriage in 1529. He then returns quite hurriedly to Rome, having sort of failed quite dramatically to please anyone in England. And actually his bags are searched at Calais, which I would suggest might well be looking for the letters. Anne Boleyn has realised they're gone and is trying to get them back. I can think of no other reason why they would be at the Vatican. You know, Anne is certainly not going to have sent them to the Vatican herself. No members of the Boleyn family will have done it. So almost certainly they were stolen. And I think the most likely reason why Anne's letters aren't there, Anne's letters to Henry, is because they belong to Henry. So he had them in a packet, perhaps in his own possession, and they weren't stolen. They obviously don't survive today, or at least they've never been discovered. Most likely Henry himself destroyed the letters, presumably after the end of his marriage to Anne Boleyn, or it's possible he was a bit less organized in keeping them and may not have, kept all the copies together, may have lost them, but I think most likely he will have had them destroyed after Anne's fall.
You can just imagine him after the execution or during the trial, just throwing them into the fire in a bit of despair, trying to act like he's been cuckolded and things like that. You can just imagine what he must have done with those letters. And
I mean, he's very neat, Henry VIII. When he cuts you off, he cuts you off. So you absolutely can imagine him just disposing of the letters, and most likely they were burnt.
Just a quick thought. Do you think that because obviously he would have been having these letters in secret, and it's Catherine of Aragon was no dummy. She would have known that probably something was going on, despite how discreet Henry was. Do you think she might have had even a glimpse at his letters to Anne or Anne's letters to him? Do you think that might have been possible?
It's a tricky one. I suspect that she won't have seen the contents, just because I would imagine that they are written and then they're sent off straight away. So she probably doesn't see the contents. She will almost certainly know that he is writing these letters. Certainly Catherine learns very quickly about when Henry orders a secret ecclesiastical court to try the validity of his marriage in 1527. Catherine knows within days of what is going on and is able to appeal to Rome and also to appeal to her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. So she almost certainly knows that Henry is interested in Anne Boleyn. I suspect she doesn't realise the extent of the relationship, because of course, why would you? It's unheard of almost for an English king to marry a subject. There are only tiny few examples, most notably of course Edward IV, Henry's grandfather, to Elizabeth Woodville. But in general, kings marry princesses, as Catherine of Aragon of course is, and they sleep with commoners, their own subjects, like Anne Boleyn. So I think Catherine of Aragon almost certainly didn't realise just how far Henry was prepared to go. She probably thinks Anne is playing a bit coy, but will eventually sleep with the king, or perhaps it will fizzle out. But I think it's unlikely that she really would have seen Anne as a significant threat in the period that the early letters at least are being written.
It's quite funny, isn't it? You wouldn't think that a king would prefer someone of a lower status than him and his wife to bed than his own wife, who was a natural born princess, would you?
No, Catherine of Aragon is incredibly noble as well. Both of her parents were sovereigns, which is only a feat matched by Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II amongst English queens. And because Catherine's mother is Isabella of Castile and her father is Ferdinand of Aragon, she is absolutely one of the best matches he could make in Europe. It's really, I think, it's the lack of sons. None of their sons survive, and that is really the point for Henry. However, it's still not a given that he would replace her with Anne Boleyn, and that's very surprising. You would perhaps expect Henry to speak to Catherine's nephew and sort of discuss the fact they don't have sons and whether he could potentially put her away and marry another member of the imperial royal family. That would be an option, and one that Charles the Emperor may well have taken. But you certainly didn't put away a woman as noble as Catherine to marry Anne Boleyn.
And I think that's why it's such a big, still today, shock that he did divorce Catherine in favour of Anne. And there is the question of whether, if Anne had never been involved, or perhaps if it was, as we can assume with Mary, a quick fling, he perhaps may not have divorced Catherine, or he might have tried a different route.
It's so difficult. So Anne Boleyn absolutely provides the impetus for the annulment of the marriage. Henry is desperate to marry her because she just won't sleep with him. He tries, and we can see it in the letters. First of all, he's trying to persuade her to be his mistress. Then he offers to make her his official mistress, which is effectively a sort of an official role. So he'll be faithful only to her. It's effectively like a morganatic spouse to some extent. So their children don't have inheritance rights, but their children will have some status. And when she turns that down, he then says, okay, let's get married. So, it's really unheard of to do that. And so Anne clearly is special to Henry. And I think, of all the women in his life, she is clearly the one that he becomes most fixated on. She's his obsession. He clearly is absolutely besotted in her. Whether another woman could have provided that impetus for him to annul the marriage to Catherine of Aragon, I'm not sure. He is troubled by his lack of sons. So he may have considered annulling the marriage, another point, but he hasn't really shown any signs before 1527, even though Catherine is long past childbearing by that stage. And he does have Mary, his daughter by Catherine, who, were he to marry her fairly promptly, she might well be able to produce grandsons that can succeed him in due course. So he does have options. And he also has Henry Fitzroy, who is his illegitimate son by Bessie Blount, and is also another option for an heir. So no, I tend to think it is Anne Boleyn that pushes Henry towards taking the decision with Catherine of Aragon.
Do you think that because we have such this wrongly put idea that, Anne seduced the king, Anne was this, sly seductress who was after the Queen's crown, who was after Henry, which, to be fair, I don't think is really true. I think all of us know that that probably wasn't true. She might have had, we can only assume she might have had some attraction to him, but we don't know because we don't have any information for that. He's quite very saucy in his letters, and he's quite prude, I think, from saying that he was, in a good way of putting it, play with her breasts. But do you think that's perhaps where we get the idea that, Anne, the modern idea that played the seduction and introduced it, initiated it? Do perhaps his saucy language towards her in his letters is where we get that from, perhaps?
I think there's a sense of it. I think in general, it's really people are guilty of looking back on what happened. So, of course, we see Anne Boleyn waiting for 6 years or so, almost 6 years, to become Henry's wife. And so we sort of look back and think she's always tried to take that role, and that's what she's been working towards. And I think that's just impossible, because she cannot have imagined that when Henry started to start talking about her pretty duckies, that he was planning to marry her. That just cannot have entered her head, and it was too ambitious for a gentlewoman in her position to even consider. So I think when these early letters are written, I think you just can't conceive of an Anne Boleyn calculating her way into the royal bed and onto the royal throne. She's really trying to get rid of him because she wants to make a good marriage. We can see that with Henry Percy, who was the heir to the Earl of Northumberland, and of course she was involved with before Henry. She clearly wants to marry well, and Henry's not offering her that. So no, I think, I think really we look at where she ended up and we think, she's been working towards that. But I think actually a lot of it is opportunistic. And as you say, it's difficult to say whether Anne is attractive back to Henry. He's clearly besotted with her. We don't know what she feels about Henry. He's good looking still at that stage. He's young, he's musical, he's intelligent. It's likely she's attracted to him. Obviously it comes out at her trial that she's laughed at his clothes and his poetry with her brother. So she obviously, there's some extent, there's sort of a feeling that she's perhaps a little superior to him in a lot of ways. But I think, I think we can assume that he's not a bad option for a woman looking to marry well. Even if, of course, he's offering her the crown, but he's also good looking. He's not the Henry of the 1540s at this stage. But I think initially she's just not showing any interest. She just wants him to leave her alone so she can continue with trying to marry well, settle into society.
Do you think that perhaps the reason why, even if Henry had very early on made the suggestion that he, would cast away Catherine for her, that she would have been perhaps appalled by it because she was smart as well. She was just as intelligent as Catherine. She would have known that if she had the same ending as Catherine, which of course she did, and tragically she had an even worse ending than Catherine, sorry to say, she would have known that there was no possible way she could be with the king if this is what he was feeling, because in the end, her becoming queen was kind of taking what was put on her lap, really. She had no other choice at this point.
Yeah, and it's a difficult thing to turn down when you're being offered the chance to marry the king. You can see why you would jump at it, to be honest. And it was said there was a prophecy that a queen would be burnt or beheaded, and that Anne sort of laughed at it and said she would carry on regardless. I think she never really saw what was coming, and you can't really expect her to do so. Even when she's in the Tower in May 1536, she says, she'll be sent to a nunnery, which is what you would assume. She can never have embarked on the relationship with Henry thinking that she would end up being beheaded on Tower Green, and nobody will have seen that coming. It's barbaric. You can annul a marriage. Their marriage is fairly easily annulable because of Henry's relationship with Mary Boleyn, possibility of finding some sort of pre-contract with Henry Percy as well. But you don't tend to behead your wives. I always think Jane Seymour must have been absolutely horrified when she discovered what was going to happen to Anne Boleyn, because it very much sets a precedent. So I think, again, in this early stage, Anne would not have been aware of her fate. And I think from what we can tell, she's not particularly close to Catherine of Aragon. They're not particularly friendly. And you can see why you might be quite happy to to take her place. Anne clearly was confident that she could produce sons. She wrote in her prayer book under a picture of the Annunciation, by daily proofs you shall me find. This I'm massively paraphrasing, can't remember the full quote. By daily proofs you shall me find to be to you both loving and kind, or something like that. But she's clearly promising Henry that she's going to supply him with some sons. So
Which is not wrong though, because obviously you don't know whether you are going to give sons, but she was a young woman, so she must have known, of course, I have a better chance than perhaps Catherine of Aragon. So you can't blame her for
there's no reason to think that there'd be a problem. And there might not have been a problem if she'd been given longer. She might well have produced a son. I mean, Elizabeth was healthy. There are 2 failed pregnancies afterwards that we know of, but that's not a terrible record for a 16th century queen or a woman. She can obviously conceive a child, but a lot of it comes down to luck, because of course Catherine of Aragon gives birth to quite a few children. 1 son lives a couple of months, 2 sons are born at or before, but sort of die at or before birth. There's a stillborn daughter as well, so she's also able to carry babies to term. It just goes wrong for her. Anne would never have realized that she wouldn't succeed, and but equally she is promising something that she can't necessarily deliver on.
And that's the thing, is that I think a lot of people who haven't studied history as much as perhaps yourself or your colleagues know, that is miscarriages or stillbirths, or perhaps children dying quite young for royals, is not unusual for them, is it? We see this quite a lot. We see this with, example, Elizabeth of York. She had many pregnancies, and even some of them didn't make it. And it's the same with Anne's mother. As I believe the quote is that she, for every year of marriage, she gave birth to 1 child, or she was pregnant. Yeah. And we see that only 3 survive. So it's not uncommon for it. And I think the reason that perhaps we might judge Anne for it is she caused such a stir for the time. Yeah. So perhaps if she hadn't, she might have been, I would say, viewed less negatively.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the infant mortality rate in Tudor England, until in fact, sort of 19th century or so, is horrifically high, amongst the highest born and the lowest. And you see it all the time. I mean, Catherine of Aragon's own parents had an awful time getting an heir. Effectively, they had 1 son and 4 daughters. Then their son dies. Then his wife was pregnant when he died, and then the baby is stillborn. Then their eldest daughter dies in childbirth, and then their grandson dies when he's 2. There's huge levels of early death. So it's neither Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn have a problem conceiving or even potentially carrying a baby to full term, because Anne Boleyn does it at least once, and possibly the second pregnancy may well be a stillbirth. She goes all the way quite some months into pregnancy before it just sort of vanishes. It's just really unfortunate that it's unfortunate for Anne that Elizabeth wasn't a boy. And I know that sounds awful, because Elizabeth I was so wonderful and such a great role model for women today as well, I think. But it would have saved her mother's life if she'd been a boy, if she'd been a Henry instead of an Elizabeth. Mary I, it would have saved her mother a great deal of heartache if she had also been a boy. But it's really just, the luck of the draw. It's 50-50.
And if we get back onto the topic of the letters, in many of Henry's letters, as we've both said before, he acts a lot like a besotted fool rather than a king who could have easily, found 100 different women in his court that would have easily been his mistress, because we do forget that in a time where today cheating is perhaps not viewed in a good way, those days a king was encouraged to have mistresses, and some men, perhaps not Thomas Boleyn, did encourage their daughters to become, the mistresses or to gain favour. And we see this with the king through, his declarations of love, his promises of what he can offer, his, as we've both said, saucy descriptions of what he would love to do to Anne, which she must have been horrified to read, to be fair. Do you believe that this shows perhaps that he was more infatuated with Anne because she didn't want to be his mistress, because she was showing a level of defiance that perhaps the other women hadn't showed, and this was perhaps an obsession more than love? Or do you think it was love that had a hint of obsession along with it?
So I would say there's definite infatuation there and definite obsession, and we can see that really she's, as you say, it's relatively easy for Henry to persuade one of the women of his court into his bed. You get husbands quite willing for their wives to sleep with the king. It's not that hard for him to get a mistress. So for Anne Boleyn to turn him down is quite surprising and really seems to have piqued his interest. And I do think he's quite obsessed with her. He builds her up. He's writing her these letters. She's clearly the dominant party in their relationship before the marriage. There are accounts of her making him cry when she threatens to leave him, for example. And I think it's quite an intense relationship. To some extent, it's sort of them against the world. I think Henry feels very much under threat. He's been thwarted by the Vatican. He's being thwarted by the emperor. There's Catherine, who won't do what he wants. And I think it does draw him to Anne. And I think we can see in the letters the level of obsession. She's clearly the focus of his thoughts, and he's absolutely besotted with her. It's more difficult. I would assume that he also loves her, or at least thinks that he loves her. It's undoubtedly the greatest passion of his life. And he's unusual again. Firstly, he's unusual because he has 6 wives, which is quite weird. But he's unusual in that he's in love with, or believes himself to be in love with, at least 5 of his wives, I would say, at the time of marriage. Not, of course, Anne of Cleves, where it all goes quite wrong. Although he does have quite romanticized views of Anne of Cleves before she actually arrives, and to some extent will have seen himself as being in love with the ideal of her. But he's quite unusual that he's free to choose almost all his wives. Even Catherine of Aragon, he didn't have to marry her. So I think he is in love to some extent with all of them, but Anne is his passion and will always be his passion. And it goes horrifically wrong. Again, I think we can't read back what Henry eventually will do to Anne Boleyn, to how the relationship is initially. I think he does fall out of love with her, and he does start to see her as someone who has promised much and delivered little. But I think in the early years, and by early years, almost sort of, really quite a long time, half a decade at least, more than that, of their relationship, he is truly in love with her. But he also does have this level of obsession. She is what he is thinking about.
It's almost like a game with him, isn't it? It's almost like a cat and mouse. Like he's chasing her, and it almost feels like he's young again, because he is. I believe he's in his late 20s when it starts, isn't it? The relationship, or the letters, at least.
Yeah. So he would be 30s.
So it'd be like he was chasing his youth in a way. Like Anne represents something else, because he's been married since he was 17, 18 to Catherine, so he's a bit older than him. So it's almost like he's chasing that part of his youth that he might have lost. And it's kind of like he will get her, or things will go wrong in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's all about the pursuit, because as soon as he's married her, he expects her to become Catherine of Aragon, but sort of younger and a bit more sexy, I guess. It's honest. As soon as he marries her, he just expects her to fit into the model of what a queen should be, as far as he's concerned. Bearing his children, ignoring his infidelities, mending his shirts, that kind of thing. The Anne, it's almost that he almost doesn't know what he wants, because the Anne that has excited him and driven him on this course isn't actually the Anne that he wants as a wife. So it's very contrary. But I think, at its heart, he is obsessed with Anne. He does love Anne. But I think all Tudor marriages, you do get such an imbalance of power, because, of course, the man is absolutely dominant as soon as you get married. And we can see it with Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour, for example, where, she's been the queen and, is in a position of dominance. As soon as they're married, it completely switches. So I think Henry isn't able to step outside the mold of what a Tudor husband is once he's actually married to Anne.
And with the letters, like we mentioned Jane Seymour earlier, and she must have been horrified over, this woman before her, her queen, has now been beheaded, and now the king is besotted with her. Do you think that perhaps, if any of his following wives, he showed the same kind of passion, same level of declaration of love, of crude behavior towards any of them, in the same way that he showed to Anne in his letters?
I think not. Obviously, we don't have the body of evidence that we have with Anne's love letters. But I think Jane Seymour, there's obviously passion there. She's the lowest born of his wives. She's the lowest born of any queen of England, in fact, so far from the throne. So there must be passion there. we can't really see it. It doesn't appear to be on the same level as with Henry and Anne, but of course we don't have the love letters to prove it. Perhaps this passion is there. Equally, of course, Anne Boleyn is a lot easier to remove than Catherine of Aragon, so Henry doesn't have to wait with Jane for sort of 6 years. His other wives, of course, Anne of Cleves is an arranged marriage. Catherine Howard, he's clearly pretty besotted with her, but again, I don't think we necessarily see the same level of passion. And again, he doesn't have the 6 years of waiting. He's able to marry Catherine Howard pretty rapidly. Catherine Parr, she's clearly very attractive. He's keen to marry her, in spite of the fact that actually, she's unlikely to bear him a child, as far as they would have believed. She does later become pregnant with her final husband, but there's no evidence that she's born a child before she marries Henry with her previous 2 husbands. So, he's clearly interested in Catherine Parr more so than her womb, if you like. But I think again, we're not necessarily seeing the passion, but I think a lot of it is to do with the fact with his later English wives, Henry simply is able to marry them. If he wants to marry them, he can marry them. He might have to wait a few months, but in general he can marry them. Anne Boleyn is a different matter. He builds up the passion without expecting to marry her, and then he really waits and waits and waits. And I think the passion is always there. I think it's difficult to see the same passion with any of his other relationships.
There is a question that one of my readers actually had, was that why would Henry go after Anne, apart from the fact, he was obsessed with her and, this was clearly a new kind of infatuation for him. If a lot of people do believe that he went after her solely for the fact that she was young and she could give him a son. One of my readers wanted to ask was, why would he go after Anne if Bessie Blount had already given him a son? There was no interest in Bessie Blount at all. That was just an affair, wasn't it?
Yeah, so contemporaries were surprised. In fact, there's this great source of one of the English ambassadors having dinner with someone in the Netherlands, I think, who sort of is saying, so the King of England wants to divorce his wife to marry an English woman, yeah? And it's like, yep. He goes, and this is the woman that's already given birth to a son to him, is it? And the person goes, oh, no. And the Englishman goes, oh, no, it's actually a different woman. And they're just shocked. It's like, what? And it is quite strange. Bessie, by this stage, is a widow, so she's free to marry. She's about the same age as Anne Boleyn, probably. Obviously, we don't have birth dates for either, but there's probably only a few years in it, if that. With her husband, Bessie has borne 2 sons and a daughter that have survived. And she, of course, has Henry Fitzroy, who is a ready-made Prince of Wales. If Henry marries Bessie Blount, he can legitimise Henry Fitzroy. So she makes a lot of sense, but he's just not interested. He doesn't want to marry her. He wants to marry Anne Boleyn.
Do you think that if, let's say, the marriage between Anne and Henry had lasted longer and he had perhaps not divorced her, I think we did have this discussion in our last one, do you think that perhaps if, let's say, Anne had another pregnancy and it was another girl perhaps, or it wasn't healthy and wasn't born, do you think he then would have legitimised Henry Fitzroy had he lived also?
Yeah, I mean, he gave himself the power in the second act of Succession. He has the power to nominate a successor, and that's clearly aimed at Henry Fitzroy. And it's really only that Henry Fitzroy then also dies that takes him off the table. I would strongly suspect that had Henry died with Edward, the future Edward VI, his 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and Henry Fitzroy, the succession order would have been Edward VI, Henry Fitzroy, and then the daughters. It's simply that Henry Fitzroy dies.
And I think that's all we have time for today, Elizabeth. But I wanted to thank you so much for talking to me once again on this brilliant subject, as I think a lot of people don't know that much about the letters between Henry and Anne. And it's something that I think a load of people could listen to and learn a lot from.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This is the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII signing off. And until then, have a Tudorific week.